what implications is there that we live in a culture that celebrates individual autonomy so much that we celebrate child sacrifice? And how would this then inform how we parent and disciple our kid? And so one thing is that individual autonomy, or expressive individualism, as Carl Truman talks about in his books. We don't want to raise children to see as the highest goal their individual autonomy.
Oh, yeah. I mean, this would run them counter to the very heart of the gospel. Mm-hmm. Erin, there is a fabulous book on culture that we reference a lot on this podcast. In fact, you personally reference it quite a bit. I think it's probably the first book you go to for wisdom and insight. And then secondly, I think it's the Bible. But it's called a Practical Guide to Culture.
Oh my gosh. I was going to say, are you talking about your book?
Authored by Brett Kunkel and John Stonestreet. Mm-hmm. No, I'm bringing that up in a humorous way. Folks, don't take that seriously. Don't take it seriously. I don't think it's the best book over the Bible. Okay. Sometimes we have to preface our sarcasm here on this on this podcast.
Just for the tender hearts.
We take some hits for some of the snark.
And by we mean you.
You're right. They don't target you.
I wonder why. It's so weird. It's so weird that the comments about sarcasm are pointed at you.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting because you're highlighting my sarcasm by being sarcastic. Yeah. So anyway, I just want to make sure you guys, everyone who's listening, I just want to publicly affirm my book is not better than the Bible. And it's funny that you'd actually have to feel like you'd have to say something like that just because the way some people take things. Okay. So we are going to do an upcoming episode on a biblical view of humor. We are going to do that. That is much needed. Especially in this day and age, because if you don't learn how to laugh, all you're going to do is cry when you watch The Culture. All right. And
that's for sure.
No, I bring up the book in a humorous way to just, I guess, review or highlight one of the things that John and I say in the book is like the most powerful way that culture shapes you is by presenting what is normal. Just by presenting what is normal. And that is such an important insight as we try to raise the next generation in 21st century American culture. Because so much of their values, their ideas, their lifestyle is shaped by what they see presented as normal in American culture. Mm-hmm. And it's a powerful force that we probably don't realize how powerful it is and I think it has stripped the church of many of its young people. Folks, this is why we have to regularly, especially when our kids are younger, protect them from culture as much as we can. And that's where there's a healthy view of protection. Sometimes we use these, I think, these derogatory or terms with like a negative connotation, like shelter your kids. Like that's kind of, that sounds now, it's taken on a meaning or a connotation that's a negative to shelter your kids. Well, shelter is actually a positive term. It's a good term. If there's a storm, shelter is a good thing. It offers protection. There is a sheltering of our kids that's important, or a protection, especially early on. And this is where, when it comes to technology, thinking about social media, protecting your kids from social media is really good, especially when you think in terms of how culture shapes us. So your kid gets on social media when they're 11, 12, 13 years of age or earlier, and they are beginning to swipe through image after image, video after video, post after post that is shaping them just by presenting what is normal. They see all their friends doing X, and all the celebrities are doing X, and all, and so much in the culture is just showcasing this stuff as this is the norm. This is just what you do. That has a powerful shaping effect. So I think one insight as we think about the power and influence of culture on our kids, on us, is we have got to protect ourselves from it.
Which require, in my mind, you jumped from talking about culture to protection, but that is assuming.
What do you mean jumped?
Like
there is a natural connection, and I thought the transition was super smooth.
In my mind, you jumped there because we were just talking about culture and it shapes you to what is normal. Like the example I gave with the last name thing.
Yeah.
It can just be it's not right or wrong.
Yeah.
It can just be a preference. But then you went to protection. So, which just requires a thoughtfulness and a reflection of what your culture is saying is normal and whether that is good or bad.
Well, so you just stole my thunder right there. That's where I was going.
Okay, well, you didn't connect it. You just jumped there.
Thank you. Okay, so here's what I was going to do.
Okay.
And next time when we sit down in our production meeting beforehand, we're gonna talk with our director.
Do we have production
manager.
meetings beforehand?
Oh my gosh, hours and hours of production meeting.
I'm not in those, so maybe that's the problem.
Oh, maybe that's the problem. I'm doing all the heavy lifting here. You just show up with your talents and just, the deep well of wisdom just comes flowing out. No.
Okay, so connect.
So
those.
You're right. So this is a good clarification. Yeah, there are some things about culture that are maybe kind of neutral. It's not immoral or
like wearing Vans. Like,
oh no. Let's be clear. Wearing checkered Vans is a moral imperative in Southern California.
And so if you this is another example actually, because as we travel around, you wear checkered Vans. It's part of your uniform, as I call it. You like black t-shirts. And if you're watching on YouTube, you will notice that every episode, Brett has a different black t-shirt.
Why are you highlighting that?
Okay, so anyway, and then the checkered Vans, which is normal wear in Southern California.
Yep.
But if we go to other states and places.
It's weird. When I go to Nebraska, they just stare at my shoes. Like they've never seen a pair of Vans before.
The young people will wear Vans, but we're not super young anymore.
Speak for yourself.
And
I identify as a 26-year-old male. So, hey, if gender can be constructed, age can be constructed. Okay? These are biological realities that can be just constructed.
So, the Vans is another example of something that's not moral or immoral.
Right. Okay. So, so I'm thinking about
the moral stuff.
The moral stuff, right? And just the ideas, the worldview stuff that were, false ideas. And so that's where I say, hey, maybe step number one, especially when our kids are young, protection is absolutely key. And don't feel guilty as a parent, or don't feel like you're you might be out of step, but you don't have to feel that you're out of step, even within Christian parenting, if you are taking a strong view of protection. And what we've always said, though, is protection is not the long-term goal. So if you think you protect all the way till they're 26, no, that's not the goal. Protection is the short-term goal so that you can do the kind of training and the kind of discipleship a 21st century kid needs to navigate the challenges of the culture. So step 2, or one of the steps, would be what you just hinted at. And that would be watching the culture, looking at the culture, examining the culture, evaluating the culture. And that is something that we just have to do as parents. Now, it doesn't mean you have to follow every single cultural trend. It doesn't mean you have to chase down every single story or article or for yourself. But what's often helpful is to be connected with those who are doing that. And so hopefully that's one reason you guys listen to MAVEN, to the MAVEN Parent Podcast, and that you follow the work of MAVEN, because that's what we're doing a lot of times. We're watching culture. And so another guy that we point people to who's doing this is a guy named Carl Truman, professor at Grove City College, author of The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self and Strange New World, as well as a bunch of other books. He is a fantastic cultural critic, solid believer, very insightful. And so follow people like MAVEN, follow people like Carl Truman. And Truman recently wrote an article for First Things. First Things is an online journal. It used to be they used to have a printed version. I don't know if they still do, but it definitely an online journal of good Christian worldview thinking. And Carl Truman writes regularly for them.
It's a journal we follow, you and I.
Yeah.
See it as a good resource.
Yeah, First Things would be another good resource. But he wrote an article kind of in response to the recent Democratic National Convention, and I want to kind of take us through this and get you to kind of comment on some of these things, Erin. But it's entitled "The Exultant Nature of Today's Abortion Advocacy."
Yeah, and just before we start, I think you were talking about being aware of what's going on in culture, and then what we try to help you do, parents, grandparents, who's ever listening, youth pastor, is to look at the stuff going on in the culture and then start to recognize the ideas that are underneath it. And this is why anything Carl Truman writes, I pretty much read, because he is so insightful in pulling out the ideas that are underneath the things that are going on, that oftentimes I don't see it, or whatever. And so you lean on people who have some insight to help you to see the ideas, because that's what we want to go after, is the ideas.
Yeah.
And so this article came out during the Democratic convention. The Republican convention had happened. And so he offered some insights that we thought were so good and it's so important to think about, especially as parents with children, raising them in this culture today.
Yeah. And, for those of you who maybe you don't feel like you are a good cultural critic, two things. Number one, that's okay. Lean on those who are. But number two, realize it doesn't always have to be that way, and that you can actually grow and you can learn to see more. And that's where growing in your knowledge of the Christian faith, your knowledge of Christian orthodoxy, your knowledge of doctrine and theology, your knowledge of apologetics, all of those things will help you to develop eyes to see. And so if I say that because I don't want people to be discouraged, like, oh, I could never get to that level. Actually, you can continue to grow in your ability to see. But it just takes time and effort and study. And so lean on guys like Carl Truman, but also realize the more you do that, the better you'll get at it as well. And then that will just give you greater effectiveness for narrating the culture to the next generation and helping them to navigate it. Okay. All right. So let me take us through this a little bit. And I'll just open up with the first parts of the first paragraph, just to kind of set the story here. Truman writes this. He says, a Planned Parenthood mobile clinic has been offering free abortions just a few blocks from the 2024 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, which concludes today. He says the DNC is not officially involved, but that is a minor detail, given that abortion has the status of a creedal, non-negotiable in the upper echelons of the Democratic Party. Okay. And so just some statement of fact there. I mean, this is what's going on at the Democratic National Convention. It wasn't sanctioned by the DNC, but you have, and kind of in hindsight or kind of post DNC, they had specific numbers on people who had abortions during this time, right? So that's just a factual, and it is a key plank in the Democratic Party's platform, right? Okay. He says it is a stark reminder. He gives some other examples of some things. He says it is a stark reminder, along with the performances of Kid Rock and Hulk Hogan at the Republican National Convention last month, of how unserious today's American politics has become. Where, one might ask, have all the grown-ups gone? Okay, just comment on that last part there. Do you think in both parties we have good evidence that there's this unseriousness in today's American politics?
I mean, that seems self-evident to me. But if you don't know a lot, this is where, again, history is instructive. If you don't know a lot about the conventions, the history of them, and how they've changed, what Carl Truman just said, if you don't know anything about the history of the conventions, what he just said doesn't really make sense, because in your mind you think, well, this is how it's always been, right? And the answer is no. And so conventions used to be speeches of persuasion, and parties were arguing out, their positions on things, and the speakers were serious in their arguments, and
as intellectuals.
Yes,
it wasn't celebrities
exactly
who you brought up on stage,
right? I like that Carl Truman does this, because he actually criticizes both in this vein appropriately, because they've become these pep rallies, and in a sense, of course, you come together, it's unifying, and that's good and important. But they've become almost these silly pep rallies where most of the speeches, it seems like to me, most of the ones I watched and read the transcripts of, are simply just putting down the other side, mocking, and maybe you could argue one side does this worse than the other, and that's fine. But obviously, both sides brings in celebrities who have no knowledge of real knowledge to offer in persuasion towards a worldview that one party is arguing for. So a Kid Rock and a Hulk Hogan are not in their positions of authority, meaning their celebrity, because they have studied social science or political theory or law or theology, we would argue, is another thing that could be important in the topic of law. And so this is his point. And then it says, one could argue, where have all the grown-ups gone? Because they do kind of seem like silly pep rallies now at this point.
Well, yeah, and you have Hulk Hogan like tearing his shirt off, right? Kind of like he would do in the WWF, doing that at the National Convention. And so, gosh, just pause there. We have our kids watch clips of those kinds of things. We have them, when we did an episode on presidential debates and watching that. But it's an opportunity to narrate for your kids. Like, look at what we've devolved to, or look at the silliness that is on display when we're talking about the president of the United States.
Yeah, people who the president and his cabinet who have a lot of power in the decisions that they make that affect our lives. And it almost seems like it's just kind of a joke.
Yeah, and so you see the silliness, you see the shallowness, you see the celebrities brought up rather than the intellectuals, and it's more of a pep rally instead of debate. And it reminds me of something I heard J.P. Moreland say probably 30 years ago the first time. He said, in today's culture, the makeup artist has become more important than the speechwriter. Mm-hmm. And that goes along with this, right? It's the image. You get the influencer up there to do some rah-rah, and that's what influences people rather than the substance of what is said. That was JP's point.
So you mentioned that we do this with our kids. We have them watch some of this stuff, not all of the stuff, but some of it. So someone might be thinking, well, why then would you even have your kids watch this if it is just kind of a silly pep rally?
Yeah.
And you wouldn't want them to be formed in thinking, oh, this is what these conventions are for or about.
Yeah. Yeah. And I kind of derailed myself in thinking, and I didn't get to why we do that and what we do with them after that. And so do you want me to like give away our little secret?
It's a secret.
The secret sauce of our family. Is that what you're
well, no, I'm just thinking we're kind of criticizing thing, and yet we're saying, but we have our kids watch it.
So we have them watch it for the purpose of narrating it to them, of examining it with them, of helping them to develop eyes to see this. Sometimes it's like, something happens, there's an event, and then you hear someone's commentary on it, and you're like, oh, I didn't really think about that. I didn't really see that. And that's how our kids are going to be, because they're still growing and maturing. And so one of the ways we can nudge them to maturity and help them to develop eyes to see is by narrating that for them. Okay, hey, what do you think about a former professional wrestler getting up, being really loud on the stage at the convention, and then tearing his shirt off,
or a music performer like Kid Rock getting up there and saying, he's going to vote for Trump. He's like, why would that? Why would you have a music artist come up and do a speech?
Yeah.
At a political convention.
Yeah, and then with the DNC, why would you? Why would Planned Parenthood feel like this would be appropriate to do free abortions a few blocks in conjunction with, so that attendees can go get a free abortion and other things. And so pausing at the beginning of this and saying, hey, these are opportunities to disciple kids. And now let's keep going with what Truman writes here. He says,
because his article actually isn't about politics, just even though we've been talking about that a little bit. The heart of the argument is about abortion and how the culture's changed. So anyway, back to kind of what the article's really about.
Yeah. And so he says, the move from abortion being sold to the public as, quote, safe, legal, and rare, unquote, to being celebrated as a necessary social good is revealing. In part, it is a reaction to the overturning of Roe v. Wade, but it is more than just a reaction. The celebration of abortion as something to be proud of started long before 2022. You want to comment on that already?
Well, I'm just thinking, I wonder how many of you listeners maybe realize this shift. And this is why reading stuff like this sometimes can be helpful, because maybe some of us are saying, oh, I didn't realize it shifted from safe, legal, rare, which of course Bill Clinton was famous for saying that in the 90s, arguing for abortion. But his argument was that we should provide abortion. Abortion should be legal, but it should be safe. It should be legal, so women don't have to go to, the argument was the back alley. So safe, legal, but it should be rare. Yeah. And so there was this recognition, it seemed to be, in why would you want it to be rare?
Exactly.
If it's just a root canal, who cares if it's rare or not?
If you're just removing a clump of cells.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this safe, legal, rare. And Carl Truman's arguing, no, this argument has been moved away from. And now the culture is not saying safe, legal, rare. They're saying legal whenever you want it. And when you have one, you should celebrate that.
They're saying shout your abortion, right? That's been a recent phrase, shout your abortion, highlight your abortion. And you've seen pictures of women who have, wear, shirts about being proud of having an abortion. So there's been this shift. And Truman goes on to say this in the third paragraph. He says, the glee with which abortion is advocated and the anger that any restrictions upon it provoke indicate that we need a different category to capture our current cultural ethos. And then so he talks about this idea of kind of disenchantment, as some cultural commentators have talked about. We live in a disenchanted world. Secularism has stripped meaning and purpose and the transcendent from our world. But he says this. He says something deeper than disenchantment is involved here. A point confirmed by the exultant nature of today's abortion advocacy. The abortion debate is not driven by mere disenchantment. The notion that the baby in the womb is just a clump of cells and nothing more. It is driven by the desire for desecration, to destroy what is sacred. We live in a world where we are taught to prize our individual autonomy and to throw off anything that might curtail or impinge upon it. That makes us feel like gods. Okay, let me pause there. I think that gives us some things to think about here. And again, we're going to relate this back to like discipleship of kids. This is important stuff to think through for the discipleship of the next generation. But he talks about kind of two things here. So it's not just driven by disenchantment, it's driven by desecration to destroy what is sacred, is I think one of the things he talks about here. And
because the argument, if people aren't aware, the argument has kind of moved from where the apologetic against abortion used to be, and still is, but it used to be, no, this is a human being.
Yeah.
And now with the advancement of science and like 4D ultrasound, you can clearly see this is a human being in the earliest stages, and you can see it with your own eyes. And so now there's kind of an abandonment of, oh, this is just a clump of cells. They no longer really argue that. It's like, oh no, it's a human being, small, but a human being, but it still doesn't matter. And so that's what he's talking about, that they've moved away from this argument to, I still have the right to do what I want, even if this is a human being.
Yeah. Yeah. And gosh, you might sit there and think, God, how could we get to that point where we would now start saying this class of human beings, they're human beings, and yet they are not valuable enough to preserve their life. In fact, we would say it's justified to murder them. Well, hey, this is not the only time in human history this has happened. I mean, we can just go back to the last century, right? Where you have obviously, German culture that said the same thing, right? Here's a class of human beings, and it was, even if they are human beings, like, and in that case, not a unborn child, but born people, like adults. And you had ideas in a culture that come to be embraced where people tolerated this. And so, I mean, just pausing and thinking about the gravity of this moment, like, and helping our kids understand that we are at a point in American culture where there is maybe, I don't know what percentage we might say, 30, 40%, at least people who would identify with this particular political party and who would also embrace all the kind of the planks of the platform and would be okay with this. That's a large portion of our culture that would be, has seemed to move in this direction.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, I in one sense, I want to say it's scary,
Mm-hmm.
right? That we're, I guess, paving the way for some potentially great evils down the road. I mean, obviously we would say abortion is a great evil in and of itself. But now we're saying we're all in on it, or there's a segment of our culture that's saying we're all in on it. Yeah, we know those are human beings, and we actually think it's okay to kill those human beings for whatever reasons.
Yeah, I think it is important to talk to our kids about that. And again, to tether it with, this is where C.S. Lewis talked about the value of reading old books, is because when we read about times in past, we're able to see their blind spots very easily. For example, in American history, we read about slavery. To modern ears, it's so obvious to us that Black Americans are not less valuable than white Americans. And it seems like such an obvious blind spot to us, right? Because we're removed from that time, and now we see things completely differently. So, but what C.S. Lewis talks about is that doing this exercise will help us to see the blind spots of our own time. And this is a blind spot of our own time. But this is what human beings do over and over again in every culture and every time. We otherize people. So whether it's Jews during the Holocaust, those are human beings, but they're lower than human beings. And the same argument is basically being made for abortion now. Okay, they're human beings, but they don't get all the rights that we do as born human beings. And what Carl Truman is saying, it's even worse than just saying they're not human beings. It's like they're celebrating that we have this power and no one's going to take it from us, to take the life of another human being and not mourn it, but actually celebrate it. And that's what makes us feel like a god.
Yeah. It is driven by the desire for desecration, to destroy what is sacred.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just a different level. It's not, and that's where he contrasts it with, not just a clump of cells. It's actually looking at that thing and going, I'm going to destroy it, no matter who thinks it's sacred. Yeah. And that's where you see the outright celebration of evil and the partaking in evil. And this is where, you start to get a sense of, I guess, looking at ancient Near East cultures and child sacrifice and all of the evil in those cultures. And you think, the Christian West was at one time far removed from that. And now as the Christian West fades, as Christianity fades, now it's being replaced.
Yeah, we are celebrating child sacrifice again.
Yeah. And so he the second thing I wanted to just highlight and comment on is, he says, we live in a world where we're taught to prize our individual autonomy and to throw off anything that might curtail or impinge upon it. That makes us feel like gods. Well, and if you think about it, this takes us right back to Genesis 3. The garden and the temptation. Oh, what is the appeal from the serpent?
You can be like God.
Yeah, you can be like God. Mm-hmm. And so the temptation and the sinful impulse and desire is actually an ancient one. But this is what we see. Mm-hmm. And American culture celebrates autonomy as the highest good. And when you lose transcendence in a culture, when you lose God, when you become more secular, right? It doesn't mean that God and worship and religious fervor and all that is out the door, because we are by nature religious beings. We're going to worship something. And what we've done is we've just erected the autonomous self as the highest being, the highest value, and it makes us feel like gods. We've replaced God with ourself, and this is just the story of fallen human history.
And so you think about parent listening, you think about what implications is there that we live in a culture that celebrates individual autonomy so much that we celebrate child sacrifice. And how would this then inform how we parent and disciple our kid? And so one thing is that individual autonomy, or expressive individualism, as Carl Truman talks about in his books. We don't want to raise children to see as the highest goal their individual autonomy.
Oh yeah, I mean, this would run them counter to the very heart of the gospel.
And this is why we, for many weeks now, and we'll continue to do, we're looking at the ideas in parenting culture and what advice you're getting as parents. And it seems to have this bent towards individual autonomy, that my self-expression as a child, a 5-year-old, 3-year-old, 10-year-old, should never be infringed on because I am the authority of me. And so this is why we thought reading this and talking through it is so important, because if our culture values individual autonomy so highly, which of course it does, then we have to be aware of where that is slipping in all kinds of areas.
Yeah. In fact, little preview for next week's podcast, we're gonna take this underlying idea and we're gonna look specifically at some kind of parenting advice and how it infects modern parenting. So, did you want to say something else on this part?
Yeah.
He goes on to say, nothing is sacred but the godlike power of the autonomous self-creator, defined by the repudiation of whatever previous generations have considered sacrosanct or sacred. And the slaying of a human being is surely the most dramatic demonstration of such. That is why abortion is now not merely regarded as a necessary evil, but as something exhilarating, something to be proud of and rejoice over. Okay. So again, this is, I think what it helps us to do is to not just let these headlines pass us by, not get desensitized to this, but to kind of wake us up. This is a good wake up. Like, this is where we're at. It's so, you should be exhilarated by your abortion, rejoice over it, be loud and proud about it, and then have the people around you affirm you and celebrate it. That's where we're at.
Yeah. And if you think, oh, come on, Carl, you're exaggerating on that abortions are celebrated now. I think if you just do a quick Google search of the Women's March, that was that 2017 after Trump, or 2016 after Trump was elected, there was a huge women's march in Washington, D.C. And you can Google that and just look at some of the pro-abortion speeches, T-shirts, signs, all kinds of things that were not simply saying a woman has a right to choose, which is kind of the old slogan, and of course there's problems with that slogan, but it's moved way beyond that to, I'm proud of my abortion. I've had 3 abortions and proud of that. There's, Miley Cyrus is that picture that she has of eating a cake that says something about her abortion. And so this idea that abortion is now celebrated it absolutely is happening in case you're just not aware of it. So you can do a little search and see how celebrated we're talking about here.
Yeah. Truman concludes his article. He says, there is a deep problem, however. Human beings, made in God's image, find themselves by recognizing the image of God in others. This underlies biblical anthropology. He goes on to say in the last paragraph, ours is an age when so much of our culture encourages us to treat others made in God's image as less than human. And then he ends with this line, our problem is thus much deeper than disenchantment. It's desecration. We need not re-enchantment so much as repentance, but that requires grown-ups. And so some cultural insight from Carl Truman on this. And I think the thing for us to take away is kind of those two things we talked about there's just evil that's being celebrated now out very publicly. It's not hidden in the shadows and in, the dark alleys. It's very loud and clear and public. And if your kids are in the world at all, they're going to see it. It's on social media. They're going to be confronted with it. And we will need to constantly narrate that for them so they don't get desensitized to it. So it isn't normalized. So evil isn't normalized for them.
Yeah. And I think too, I just wanted to point out one thing I thought of when I read this article is how thinking about abortion being celebrated and human individual autonomy being celebrated is, of course, if you've had children, you know how much you give up of yourself for your children. Now, God calls that good. But if we live in a culture that values autonomy so much and looks at children as an inconvenience, as an impediment to my dreams and my future, that can affect us as parents. And I just think...
Oh, you're definitely not going to want to have as many of those.
Oh, yeah,
if
for
they're
sure.
going to be an impediment. And guess what? We have a shrinking demographic, right?
Yeah, which is, I think, comes out, for example, when we tell people we have 5 children. Now, not always. Sometimes, of course, it's just not normal culturally to have that many children anymore. At least not in Southern California. I know in like Utah, it's very normal. But so just having 5 kids, but sometimes that view that children are such a pain comes out when people hear that I have 5 kids, because they're oh my gosh, how do you do it? And they have this look of like repulsion on their face. And you and I have come up with answers that we try to give, like, oh yeah, we love it, or
that's one of our non-snarky answers.
Yeah, you have some snarky answers too. But underneath that, sometimes, I'm not saying everybody, so hear me correctly, but is this idea like, oh, kids are a pain. Why would you want to have so many of them? And when we live in a culture that values autonomy and ours has been taken away, quote unquote, taken away by these kids we've had, we can start to view our kids in a negative way like that. And we need to renew our mind with truth through the scriptures on how God views our kids and how God views our sacrificial love towards our kids too.
Yep. So, hey, ideas matter. Ideas have consequences. Worldview matters. And this is why biblical worldview, Christian worldview is so vital. It's such an important tool for us as believers to navigate the challenges of this world. And so let's maybe in our homes this week, let's just teach that to our kids. Just that phrase, ideas have consequences. And just let that become a mantra in your home as you try to help your kids, the children who you are responsible for discipling, and just navigating the culture yourself. Let that become a mantra. Ideas have consequences that help guide us in navigating a very challenging world, and even an evil world.
MAVEN exists to help the next generation know truth, pursue goodness, and create beauty for the cause of Christ. To find out more, check out maventruth.com.